Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the Heart of Alaska, presented by Annie Van Dinther and Corbin Hawkins. Corbin is NatHab's Field Operations Manager, guiding for us in North America since 2015, and Annie is NatHab's Guide Development Director, leading trips for us since 1999. Thank you both so much for being here today. Annie, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Kendall, thank you so much for that introduction and for all your help in getting these set up. And thanks to all of you out there for joining us. We love getting to see you every week. Well, we don't get to see you, but we love that you're here looking at this presentation with us. And I'm super excited about today, even I will admit a little nervous. We are going to turn the tables a bit. So I've got Corbin Hawkins here, a good friend and coworker, and he is going to help me talk with you about the heart of Alaska. So before we get going into that, Corbin, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. I'm excited about this one, Annie. Our first try at this, we talked about Churchill kind of back and forth with each other, and then you got to speak to me about Yellowstone, and now the tables have turned completely, and we get to hear from you and where you're from and in the heart of Alaska. And to kick that off, I think it's worth mentioning, I myself have never been to Alaska, so this is kind of like you taking me on a trip. So let's just talk about the basics, right? Tell me about Alaska. Give me the the quick and dirty. Tell me what Alaska is.
All right, great. Well, I'm super excited to bring you to my corner of Alaska. I think it's an incredibly special place, obviously. And so first off, Alaska is a huge state. A lot of people don't realize how big it is. Makes Texas look small. Sorry, Texans, but it's true. It, in some ways, can be described as being about the quarter the size of the United States, the lower 48, which is the way that we refer to the lower 48, the southern part of the United States. It is an incredibly big state that has more caribou than people. It has about 1 square mile for each person. Now, obviously, we don't live all spread out like that, but it's roughly 700 and some thousand square miles and the same number of people. So the population of Delaware, but the size of many states put together. So it's a big place. The state itself was formed in '59 as an official state, and we're a unique place. We are really far from the rest of the United States, and so we've sort of become our own place, if you will. And then where I live is what's called the Kenai Peninsula. And so I've put a little arrow there. You can see Kachemak Bay, which is, I can see out my window to look at the bay there. And across from Kachemak Bay, which you can't quite tell with this photo, is just mountains. So where I live, there's this little coastal town, Kachemak Bay, and then we can see mountains in the background. It's really a beautiful area. When my mom comes here, or when she calls me, she'll say, "What is it like living in a postcard today?" And I think that's a pretty good way to describe where we are. Now, to understand the history of this place and why Alaska came about, we really do have to look into things like gold and oil, the resources of this place. Have you ever been panning for gold, Corbin?
I have as a kid in Colorado. Yeah.
Nice. It's something we do sometimes with our guests. If they want to go pan for gold, you can still do that at the Kantishna Lodge that we go to inside Denali. It's why people rushed here, right? The gold rush happened, and lots of people made their fortune. Interesting enough, Robert Service, who writes tons about the gold rush, his poems maybe from What We Do in Churchill, right?
Sure.
It turns out when he wrote those poems, he had never been to the North. He was in a bar in San Francisco listening to those stories from other people who'd been to the North. So it just held this lure that drew people here. This is the city of Anchorage. I don't know if you would call it a city in the lower 48. It's 300,000 people. So it's a small city, maybe 350, but it's about half the population of our state. And as you can see, Anchorage is right up to the mountains. I mean, it itself is kind of plopped down in the middle of wilderness, really. The thing about Anchorage is it's the hub for the oil industry. And the oil industry, the pipeline, is in many ways what sort of put Alaska on the map outside of that gold rush. So we are a wealthy state in the sense of resources, and oil is very much so part of our culture here. It's our state is, some would say that we put too many eggs in one basket, that a lot of our economy is based on that. And then there's fishing. Fishing is the other huge industry that we have here. It's absolutely part of our life. This is the beginning of an opener in Bristol Bay, very near where we do our bear viewing. And it's the lifeblood of the state in many ways. And then nowadays, you can't really understand Alaska historically or now without these float planes and bringing people around. The next resource is the tourism that we have here. People wanting to come and see world-class safaris here in Alaska. So that's kind of a quick basic rundown.
And just recently, something that's kind of happened for the first time in history here, we have that tourism industry and the fishing industry kind of working together for a common goal. You want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really exciting. Normally we could maybe accidentally see those as competing industries. Even the bear hunting industry and the bear viewers like us, we are even coming together a bit, and that's because of Pebble Mine. That area, Katmai, Bristol Bay, all of that, really even our home here in Kachemak Bay waters are all threatened because of Pebble Mine. And so we've seen some industries come together in some really cool ways that hasn't happened in the past. It's pretty good. So that's the basics, but I want to bring you to my Alaska.
Yeah, you just gave me a big sort of, holistic view of Alaska, but let's zoom in a little and see what's Alaska to you.
Yeah, so if you were going to come visit us, which lots of guides have, so you're welcome to. It is a thing that happens. If Mike Hillman is watching, hi Mike, he was one of our more recent guest guides, or guide guests, if you will. We're right back to those resources. It's the PFD. So there's some vocabulary that's going to come up in this talk. What do you think PFD means, Corbin?
This is personal flotation device, right?
It is, and they're very important to us here in Alaska, but it also means permanent fund dividend. And the thing is that we couldn't live here in many ways without that. Now, what that means is that oil that we talked about, the dividends from investing in that oil is shared with all of the citizens of Alaska. So we get a check every year for each member of our family. It's usually around $1,000, but that's a $5,000 check when you got lots of kids like me. And people look forward to it. In many ways, the state economy is built back onto it because we're all going to go spend some money when that PFD comes out, even if it's just going out for dinner or something like that you wouldn't normally do. Alaska is an expensive place to live, that's for sure.
Well, I guess you could say it keeps you afloat in a way, right?
There you go. It does keep us afloat. Now, another vocab word that you're going to have to know if you want to come tide pooling with us, Corbin, is extra tufts. In fact, we usually have several extra pairs of extra tufts around the house just for when guests come, because you can't really move through this coastal temperate rainforest area without having your muck boots. So let's go tide pooling.
Yeah, what do you mean tide pooling? What is that?
That's not something you do, I guess, where you live, huh? So
no.
Tide pooling, it's one of our most favorite activities. We have huge tidal fluxes here, sometimes as much as 25 feet in tidal exchange. It's one of the biggest tidal exchanges in the world. In fact, in Anchorage, there's a place called Turnagain Arm, and they have a bore tide there, which means the tide changes so drastically, it makes its own wave. There's only a few places in the world where that actually happens. So here in Homer, when it's low tide, the water goes out and we end up with these pools of rocks and water and sea creatures. And those sea creatures are exposed at low tide in a way that they aren't, the rest of the day. If you've ever been on a trip with me, if there's some people watching who've traveled with me, you know that I'm going to tell you that polar bears are not the toughest animal on the world. It's actually the intertidal zone animals.
So what are we looking at here? What is this intertidal zone animal?
This is a sea peach, and it's one of my daughter's favorites. That you can see why it's called that. She did a report on this one. Tide pooling is something all the kids do. This is actually a group of eggs. So it looks like sand or sandpaper, and there's all kinds of little zooplankton eggs in there. And then this one is a lion's mane jellyfish. So you got to be careful when you're tide pooling and you see these guys. They can sting quite a bit. So, but this is something that we do. We're watching the tides sort of constantly. And if we see that it's a good low tide, usually, of course, then around a full moon or something like that, we're going to head out and check out what kind of creatures are exposed to the air that would normally be underwater.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to come do it. I'm going to visit you one of these days.
Good.
You know, that reminds me of when I was a kid, like playing in the creek behind the house looking for crawdads with my brother. But you guys don't just use this stuff for fun, right? I mean, you find a lot of resources in the water.
That's exactly right. And I have to tell you, when you come to visit, there's one thing I need to make sure you're going to do. And that is when you see this animal, you're not going to call it a fish. This is not a starfish, okay? It's a sea star. You know you're hanging out with your naturalist nerd friends when we care about that, but it's an echinoderm, and that's a critically important thing. So yeah, the resources, Corbin, what do you think this is?
At first glance, it looks like oil. It looks like an oil spill.
It does, and it's not that actually. So these are my son's hands, and this is Octopus Ink. I do love to draw and paint and whatnot, and so when they do get an octopus that we would eat, they also are so kind to extract the ink for me, and then I can make drawings from that. It's one of my favorite things to do. But it's not just octopus that we will use as a resource here, and I have to say, I married a man who was a trapper in Churchill. And so we have spent our married lives together having great discussions about to hunt or not to hunt, to fish or not to fish. And when it comes to living in Alaska, the cost of groceries are very high. They're not quite as bad as Churchill, but they're high. So we need the protein that we get from the fish. This is a halibut that my son caught there. That was about 80 pounds. So that's 80 pounds of protein that we get for the winter, which is key. This one, another halibut. My daughter was very excited that she was the same size as the fish.
How long does a fish like that feed your family for?
Well, so if it's, let's say it's 80 pounds, that one probably we end up with 50 pounds of actual meat after it's all been cleaned. And so, you know, if you kind of think about having halibut once a week for 50 weeks, yeah. That's kind of the way that we think of it. Maybe some people plan on having a chicken once a week for their family, right? And sometimes halibut is called the chicken of the sea because It's a very just like white kind of protein. Salmon is the other thing that really feeds our family. This is a typical scene of an Alaskan family here. It's fish cleaning day, and you can see the salmon skeletons there. Those will be used for fish soup. So we will really use the whole fish. The heads and the bones will help with the soup. And then we put up pounds and pounds of it so we have that protein during the winter. And all of us learn how to do it. Even my daughter who hates fish, even she learns how to fish. So it's just part of who we are, basically, which I didn't think I would say in my life, but it's true.
Yeah. And it's not just fishing, right? I mean, this land offers so much. You keep bringing up the land, and we've talked about land in all sorts of different places over the world, but to you, this land holds something a little more near and dear.
It does, and berry season is like this, it really does become sacred. We talked about that in the description of this, but there's something about picking berries that is incredibly meditative. And we never have, for example, canned cranberry sauce at Christmas. We have got to get our own cranberries. And in a way, I think it's a sign of like, it's hope, first of all, for the dark winter coming. It's also resourcefulness, which is probably one of the most valued sort of I don't know if you call that a virtue, but characteristics is resourcefulness here in Alaska. It's almost like that's what makes you rich, is your ability to use what's in front of you. I think that's a sort of key philosophy here. This is something called chicken of the woods. Do you know what that is?
No, I do not.
I think it's so fun, these words that we have here that we just think are sort of a normal part of life. And then maybe if you come visit, you're like, why do they keep talking about these chicken of the woods? Like, I've had people wonder if we have wild chickens here in Alaska, but it's a mushroom. You can see it here on this tree. And it's also a very kind of bland thing that you could add to stir fry or something like that. Or chickens, they always get the name of things that are bland, I guess.
It's funny that you mentioned using these resources and kind of knowing that that's an indicator of something to come, but it's not always that you're consuming resources. Sometimes it's just your knowledge of being in the area and things you've learned over the years that kind of guide your year. So right here, we have fireweed. I, of course, know what this is guiding here in Yellowstone, but this means something totally different to you and likely myself than maybe some other folks.
It does. It's when I first started writing columns, which I used to do for the newspaper, my first column was called Fireweed Makes Me Sick. And it's not because I'm allergic. It's because this, when the little seeds on top go, it looks almost like smoke. It's a white cottony fluffed on top there. When those start to do that, it means that winter's coming. It means that we're at the end of summer. And when you live in a place where you have days that are 5 hours long in the winter, winter coming puts a little in your, it's a weight on your chest. There's wonderful things about it, of course, but there's also this like, okay, we have something we're about to make it through. It's not going to be that easy always.
Sure. But you know that you're heading into that season because of, I mean, basically you're using your knowledge base as a resource for your day-to-day life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in other places, I don't know, maybe people would look at like when the ball drops, or I'm thinking of other like cultural things that might tell us the time of the year, right? You start to hear Christmas carols in the store.
Sure.
Whatever that, they do that earlier and earlier though, I think. So I'm not sure you can trust that one. But for us, yes, it is definitely the animals, it's the plants, it's what we're gathering around that time of year. And speaking of that, no matter where you live, even if it's downtown Anchorage, you might have moose right out your front door. So you do have to learn some skills here.
And this is taken right in front of your house. I mean, I'm assuming you get animals all the time. In talking with you before this trip, the cranes, excuse me, seem to stand out. You get them all year round. Tell me about the cranes.
The cranes are like, I guess they're another harbinger. I didn't even, sometimes I don't realize until I talk about with someone else how much these things mean. But for us, the cranes, they come in the spring, and when they do that sound, it's like that feeling you had from the fireweed, it's lifted.
Sure.
And you made it through. You're on the other side. The days are getting really long at that point, and things are warming up. We call that season breakup. It doesn't mean you're breaking up with someone. It means that the ice is starting to break up, and you can maybe travel to some places that you couldn't before, or not travel because the road could be so torn up during breakup that you've got to give it a break. And then this time of year, it's a sad time because we will start to hear the cranes gather up. So we've heard them all summer. They've been in our yard. We see the little babies grow. It's so cool. And then we'll start to hear them group up. And that means it's time for them to go. So that's another sort of like, oh, we're heading into the time without the cranes. Now there's another animal that we have to deal with on a regular basis, but you have moose where you live, right?
We do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've walked up the moose right in the front door before.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have that same thing that, I didn't realize when I moved here that I would be raising kids who have beast awareness. or beast training. But at any moment, they could walk out the front door and see a moose. And I tell you, I don't know if this is true for you, Corbin, but moose scare me far more than bears.
They're terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. Getting trampled by a moose is not an awesome thing at all. So we have to be prepared for
Yep.
these kinds of things. And this is my daughter. She made her survival kit. And that is a normal thing here. You can see some things that probably look familiar to you in that kit.
Yeah, first thing first, my eyes go to the bear spray. It's not every day. How old is she?
In this picture, she was probably, 7. And yeah, she already knew how to use that.
Yeah, it's not every day that a 7-year-old comes equipped with bear spray.
Yeah, that's true. And my son too, they've got to be able to put something together that shows that if something would happen to us, of course we don't plan on that, but if we were out with them in the wilderness and something happened to us, they need to be able to take care of themselves at a young age if you're going to put them in, a camping or a wilderness situation.
And there's so many considerations, right? It's not just the animals in the front yard. It's not just the bear spray. You guys spend a lot of your life on the water. You've already mentioned the tides a little bit. But that's a massive consideration. That's a deep piece of knowledge that you have to have an understanding of to make your life work in Alaska.
Yeah, it's true. When we want to say go across the bay, that's how we would say it. Now, if we did say also, I have to catch this one, if we would say we're going to go outside, it doesn't mean we're going to walk out our door. It means we're going to go visit you. We're going to go outside of the state of Alaska. But back to these tides, if we were to go, say, plan a trip across the bay to go camping, this is my husband and our dog a few years ago, all loaded up so we could go camping. And if we got those tide wrong, we'd be stuck. So this is actually good planning. Might not look like it because you're seeing him walk through the water, but this means he can pull the boat right up to where we were camping. If it was low tide, that boat would be really far out and we'd have to,
back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we've got to pay attention to the moose. The cranes aren't, something, they're just pure joy. They're not necessarily something that's dangerous. Even bears in our yard, the tides, all of these things. But all this leads to really fun adventure that I think is at the core. So when you come to visit us, we're going to go tide pooling. We're going to go fishing. We're going to go across the bay. And when we go across the bay, we're going to go check out a glacier. And so you got to bring your wetsuit and you got to bring your wetsuit boots.
I love the water, and especially when I hear glacier, my mind immediately goes to, can I swim in that? I want to go right in.
Yes, you can definitely swim in it. You can jump into some of this glacier water with my kiddos and just really get an incredible experience. When I asked my husband, Joe, today what he thought the heart of Alaska was, he said adventure. He said that's the heart. This is Easter for us. So some people
plunge.
Yeah, exactly. So it's we have a tent that we made out of like organic canvas kind of stuff, and we make a sauna on the beach, and then we get all warmed up, and then we run into the ocean, take a plunge, and then that's our Easter preparation, if you will.
Yeah, that sounds like a good time. You've mentioned quite a few different terms. Maybe we can come back to some of those a little bit later to clear it up. But one that you and I share in common that we're both familiar with is Alpenglow. And it's just stunning, but you get it in Alaska probably, how much more often than we would get it down here? You get it all the time.
We get it a lot. Of course, if it's super, super cloudy, then, we don't get it. But yeah, it's this kind of glow that happens at sunrise or dawn and at sunset, which means we don't see it much in the summer because that sunrise and sunset is happening in the middle of the night when we're hopefully asleep. So in the winter time though, or the fall, this is one of the good things that we look forward to when the cranes are leaving and the fireweed is blooming, and that's the beautiful light. And it's magical.
Yeah, you know I'm a lover of the natural phenomena like that. So for those listening, if you ever have the chance to go far enough north to see something like this, or to see the midnight sun in the summer, like on top of everything else, to me, that actually gets my heart racing a little bit, is to see such unique kind of landscapes and just kind of what the sky provides in that time of year.
So I think you're going to have to come during the fall, because then we're going to get you that, like, well, fall, we call fall August. I guess other people call that summer still. But that way you'll get some of that light, and you'll get some of these other things that we've talked about. So that would be a good time.
It's a great time of year for wildlife, right?
It is. And for whales that are coming through, we're actually going to talk about this next week. So we're not going to spend too much time here today, but the whales of Alaska are phenomenal, and we get a lot of species that are traveling through this area. So these are humpbacks, actually in Southeast Alaska, and those areas are just teeming with life. So one of the things you're going to have to come see when you visit us are the whales of Alaska.
And how often would you say, just in your day-to-day life where you live, are you running across whales? Do you see that pretty often?
We do. Like, my kids sometimes will, maybe they'll go fishing with my husband, and I'll stay home, and they'll come home, and I'll get like the whale report, whether it's orcas or humpbacks. My daughter, for her birthday, we were out at a hotel called Land's End. Some folks who maybe have been to Homer for our Nat Hab trip stayed there. And so we had a birthday party there for her. This was pre-COVID, and there's a hot tub outside. So we were, the kids are in the hot tub, and the whales you could practically run out and touch one just right off the end of the spit there. And that's it for her birthday. They're sitting in a hot tub watching whales, and that's normal.
Yeah, what a cool thing to say, that's part of just your like day-to-day life, right? That's just a day in the life of an Alaskan.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
We're getting to the point I think everyone's maybe been anticipating that's listening, is the bears. You and I share an obvious love for these. And you're fortunate enough in Alaska to have a few different species.
We are, and I think this photo of the Alpenglow is probably one of my all-time favorites. This was over at Lake Clark, and so that's across Cook Inlet from me. And this is the brown bear, of course, but we also have polar bears up in Kaktovik, so on the north coast, right kind of next to where Alaska meets Canada. There's a wonderful place. Now, there's other places on the north coast that you could see them, but that's the place that I've been. And then there's black bears, and we've got one hanging out in our neighborhood here recently, but this photo was taken at Annan Creek, which is in Southeast. And one of the neat things about that place is you can see black bears and brown bears in the same river system.
Oh.
So that's pretty cool. Which one do you want to come here to see?
Well, you know what? I love polar bears, but I have seen quite a few. I would love to get out and see bears, to see grizzly bears, Alaskan grizzly bears. We've got them here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but I got to go see those Alaskan brown bears.
All right, cool. Well, I have to show you one more picture of a whale before we do that. At that same place at Annan Creek, you can sometimes see orcas go through, as well as here in Kachemak Bay. And we can't forget these, so we'll talk about these next week. And then before I really bring you bear viewing, the way you can in Katmai, I gotta have you head to Denali with me for just a little bit.
You can't think of it without considering Denali anyway, right? It's at the forefront of what's important.
It's a really magical place, and I think there's probably some really great statistics on how it is also as big as some states, just the park itself. So it's huge. This is a big bull moose at Wonder Lake. So if I was Mike Hillman, you could see the mountain really clearly in the background. He seems to have the best views of Denali. He's got great luck. I think every time he's been to the park, he has seen the mountain. So take a trip with him. We'll make sure he's there with us when we take this trip. Caribou are one of the most phenomenal things that you can see in Denali, and they're pretty guaranteed. I mean, we never like to say that, of course, as guides, but it's very likely that you will get to see these guys. And you know what Rhonda says about the caribou, right? About the reindeer.
Fill me in.
Okay, well, this is one of the only ungulates where the females have the antlers as well as the males.
Sure.
And around Christmas time, it would only be the females that would still have the antlers. So based on this, we know that all of Santa's reindeers were actually female.
Ah, there you go.
We can talk to Rhonda about that sometime.
I like that.
When we go down this road in Denali, we're going to see bears. So we'll start to get our taste of seeing some grizzlies. These are not the same as the brown bears along the coast. They're different, right? This is more like what you have in Wyoming, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah. Big open vistas and hanging out on the mountaintops.
Yep. And so these guys are, I think of them as excuse my language, but pretty badass. I think they're quite tough. They really have to be able to go after those larger animals. They have to go longer periods of time with more sparse resources. And they don't necessarily have that rich salmon run to make life pretty easy for them. So I think of them as pretty scraggly and ornery and aggressive.
Well, they're traveling big miles. They're traveling over rough terrain. They've got limited resources. Yeah, they're tough.
That's right. And then one of the other things that is so phenomenal about Denali, of course, is the vistas and the views. I know for you, someone who loves this big, wide open country, you will go crazy when we finally get you to Denali. You will love it. I'm not going to be able to get you out of there when it comes to photography stuff.
Well, I'll just have to extend my trip. But let's zoom it back in a little bit. Let's get kind of closer back to your home and your experience with grizzly bears, and kind of specifically what it's like sharing space with them and sharing this land that you've talked about so much with these giant charismatic megafauna.
That's right. So this is a picture of my daughter's footprint and her hand, and then a black bear footprint. And you know, this isn't that weird. Like, I feel like other people, I myself, 20 years ago, having not lived in Alaska, I would have just thought, oh my gosh, you're looking at this print of a bear and a kid, and it seems intense, but we live with them. Look at this guy. This is over at Brooks. The tenacious look in this bear's eye is one of my favorite things. Like, he's like, I'm gonna make it up there. he's clear on that, I think.
Yeah, determined.
Yeah, and this bear was nothing but entertaining. Look at that little tongue sticking out there. This is also at Brooks Falls. I'm going to focus some attention there now. I feel like we've spent a little more attention in some of these talks on the trips that we get to do with the Ursus over in Katmai, and our other trip, the Alaska Safari, goes to Brooks, which is also in Katmai, but it's a little more accessible. Now, I have to tell you, I brought you to this water scene because of what we talked about last time, when you said that water was the heart of Yellowstone. And I loved that, Corbin. It struck me as different than what people would think, but the more we talked about it, it made so much sense.
Yeah, and you tie a little bit of that same notion into Alaska, right? I mean, if you think of it, if you think of nature logistically, so to speak, all of that starts and ends with water, in my mind.
Right.
And it seems especially true in Alaska.
It's the great connector, really. And, you know, this is at Brooks Falls, where we're, of course, wanting to be watching bears. And these mergansers, what they like to do is go up to the waterfall, the famous waterfall with the fish going into the bear's mouth. They swim up as close as they can to it, and they ride a little wave back down, like their own little water park. Super entertaining to watch. And then, of course, the salmon, they're traveling from thousands of miles. The lifespan of a salmon has got to be one of the most miraculous things in nature. And the eagles are there gathering, you know, trying to get the salmon. They're loving the leftovers. The bears are waiting. I love this photo. I know the bear is a bit blurry, but you can see the salmon in the water. And I love that you can sort of see them, you know, jumping up underneath there.
This is such a great shot, by the way. I don't know if you want to just spend another second on that one there, but
This one?
yeah, it's classic. I've never been there, but seeing these photos through you guys, I can place myself right there.
Yeah, it's I have an obsession with black and white bears. I have always had my sort of favorite bear shots are black and white. And what I like about this shot in particular is that the fish isn't, you can see they're there, but it's not that exact fish into the mouth scene.
Sure.
Because most of the time, these bears are waiting in that exact spot, and they're not having that moment. They're waiting. They're waiting. This guy here, he would choose, instead of being in that spot, he would just plunge his head into the water to get at the salmon and then come back up. So he's just always soaked, which is very cool. This is obviously a mama bear. And this mama bear is pretty famous. So we're gonna I'm gonna share a little story here about this bear, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'm gonna get the names wrong, and if anyone out there is watching this and you pay attention to Brooks Falls and the bears and you know their names, that's so cool. And so I'm gonna give them some different names than what they really have just for the sake of the story, but I'm fully recognizing that I'm probably switching a few of them.
Okay.
So we've got this bear here. This is a second-year cub, and this is really the heart of our story. We have known for years, and you've probably heard this up in Churchill as well from photographers, that when polar bears go to a lead in the ice, often they'll switch cubs.
Right.
Or if something happens to the mom, a female bear will often just take more cubs.
Sure.
It's a pretty interesting thing that until a few years ago, we didn't have actual photographic proof that this happened. There's a lot of photographers who would say it happened, that they'd experienced it, but we didn't know for sure until a few years ago at Brooks. So at Brooks, we have a bear named Holly. That's just a name we're gonna use. Holly she's prolific. She has a lot of cubs every year, and she tends to get distracted. So what happened a few years ago is that Holly lost a cub, and another bear, we'll call her Jane, I might be switching those names, Jane found that cub. Now Jane, when she found that cub, she didn't have her own cubs already. She had them before, but she didn't have one that year. So in other words, she wasn't nursing. So she was going to have to provide for that adoptive cub just with fish. Now you can see here that there's two cubs behind this bear. One is a second-year cub and one is a first-year cub. So
Sure.
what Jane did is she adopted Holly's cub, and then the next year she had her own cub, and she raised them together. And the really cool thing is her adopted cub she kept for longer.
I was going to ask, where was that split?
Yeah, she gave that cub more resources, which it would need, right? It would need that leg up from that trauma. So these next few photos are of Jane being a phenomenal bear mom, which, remember, Holly, not necessarily the best. We kind of have this stereotype that all bear moms are phenomenal, and they're phenomenal in their own way, but some of them get distracted by food and sex like really easily. And that, yeah, exactly. And that would be Holly. So this is Jane. The bigger cub is actually Holly's cub. And one thing that I have to say before we watch this is that Holly was watching all this happen. So she was feeding in the same river system with her adoptive cub. I mean, Oprah would have loved this, right? It was perfect. So here they are. And, in this one, mom realizes something's up, right? You can see that she's attentive. Then we get them all together. And then you can see these guys just like looking around, like, whoa, what's going on? Look at them running. I love the look on this guy's face. What the heck is happening? What is going on? And then, Yeah, and then mom is defending these young ones. And so she's here and she's gonna give it the best protection. And interestingly, she's the one who kind of bows down. She fights for him long enough, just long enough to give them a chance to get away. And then she's like, all right, I don't really need a full-on fight. And so she's the one, the more blonde one, they're kind of bowing out, and then there she goes, she's off. So that's just one of the kind of really magical things that I've witnessed here in Alaska, specifically at Brooks, and I love it. I'm totally enthralled with these stories with these bears and how they make their way in this world. It's incredible to me.
Yeah.
So.
And it's funny. So just hearing you talk about bears, I can see your excitement, and I can sense that you have, there's a sense of place that you kind of tie in with your lifestyle, and it's fully regarded to the bears. When I think of Alaska, I'm kind of on the same page as your husband. I think of adventure, I think of skiing, I think of snow and big mountains and all these sorts of things. But for you, it sounds like maybe the heart of Alaska is the bears. Would you say that that's the case?
Well, certainly I think of the bears, and I came here because of the bears. This is what brought me to this place. When my husband and I first met, he lived in Churchill, I lived in Cape Cod. We tried Michigan. There's no bears in Michigan. There's no whales in Michigan. And long story short, we ended up here, and it was because of a lodge that we were going to work at that had bear viewing. So I'm here because of them. I stayed because of them. My job is intricately tied to them, but at the same time, the way that they are so dependent on the salmon, so are we. And we have a way of life here that I don't think my kids, they would have had a great life if we lived somewhere else, right? Hopefully. But they wouldn't have this knowledge and connection to the land that I've only ever seen other kids get, maybe in Churchill. I'm sure they get it in lots of places, but for us, I think it comes down to the way of life.
Yeah, is she skiing to school both ways is what comes to mind when I think of this. And I think that mirrors exactly what you're trying to say. Like, some things in Alaska are just different, whether that's having a bonfire at midnight in the full sun or going to see bears. But just to kind of close here as we approach the end of our chat, what are a few other things in your day-to-day with you or your children that are just Alaska? And what is, to close, what are some of those way of life things that you connect with so much?
Sure. Well, okay, so this skiing is definitely one of them. This is just cross-country skiing is a sport here. And then downhill skiing is a huge part of their life as well. I'm personally not a downhill skier. Maybe some year I'll learn those skills, but I do cross-country skiing. The other thing I will say, though, is, our kids, it's dark when they go to school in the morning, and that happens in other places. I mean, I remember growing up in Michigan, it was often dark when we went to school, but it's also often dark when they come home. So we do spend a lot of time with those extreme things like you were talking about, all hours of the day in the summer. When people talk about bedtime for their kids in the summer, we don't even really pay attention to it in the same way because it doesn't get dark. So you can't say to your kids, make sure you're home by dark. That won't work.
Right.
Also, our kids, people maybe have seen the Discovery show about the Kilters. My kids grew up on that homestead in many ways. We don't live there, but my very best friend does. And so farm school and, being on four-wheelers and kind of having this pack of kids that's out in the woods. These are some of our dearest friends. The high tunnel that you see in the back, that's a garden system that gives us a longer period of time. But all of this, I have to say, as we close, all of this is changing rapidly because of climate change. And we are seeing, just in the 20 years that we've lived here, almost 20 years, we have seen huge differences. Like this year, for the first time, we had lightning where we live. Lightning has never happened in the last 16 years that we've lived here. It doesn't get warm enough. Now it happens up in Denali and the big scapes and whatnot, but not here. So when I think about our home, the heart to me is the way of life. And that way of life is at risk. We are being affected by climate change.
And it's funny because when you think of Alaska, you think of all these extremes that you're talking about, whether it is climate change or just the size and the stature of the mountains or these huge animals and just all the work it takes to make a life there. But what you're saying is the heart is actually the intricacies, the minutia, the little things that you do to make life in that climate work. And so I like that you went to that level, as just instead of just approaching it for face value, you went a little further and you found something that really all Alaskans and anyone visiting, I think, will connect with when they get there.
I think that's so true, Corbin. And I had a friend who lives here, and she went to visit Montana actually one time during the summer. And she came back and I said, how was it? And she said, they're just playing. They're just recreating. Like we're busy gathering fish and, picking berries and making sure the garden is going to produce enough so we have our food for the winter. And she was like, it was amazing. I spent a whole week just playing. And our way of playing here is surviving in many ways.
Yeah, no, I spend my winter skiing in Jackson Hole. So, if your kids want to show me how to go fishing, I'll teach them how to ski.
That sounds perfect. They're quite proud of their skiing here in Alaska because we've got, like I said, I don't downhill ski, but apparently there's the biggest elevation drop in the shortest distance, or my son is going to correct me as soon as I'm done with this, but something like that.
It's steep.
So, it's steep, exactly. They're convinced they could ski anywhere after doing that.
All right, challenge accepted.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Kendall, I think that we have come to the end of this, and we're ready to answer questions if anybody has any.
Great. Yeah, we do have some questions for you. And I'd like to remind folks watching, if you have questions for Annie or Corbin, you can submit those in the control panel in the questions field. Okay, we'll start off with some more cultural questions.
Sure.
What's the percentage of population of Indigenous people, and what are the different Indigenous cultures?
Ooh, that's a great question, and it is a subject that we did not spend time on here today. We recognize that as we were planning this. There's 13, I believe it's 13 different corporations, and when I say that, rather than reservations like there is in the lower 48, we have corporations for our Indigenous groups. And it's we could do a whole webinar on it. But basically, I think we kind of learned from the reservation system. And the idea was that there were some funds put up, and then the different groups could manage those funds as they saw fit. Some of them made tons of money and have these like big, huge corporations, and some are, just kind of making their way through. As far as the exact number of different groups, I'm not going to dare quote that. It's a lot. 13 is probably close to some representation of that, but there's a lot of nuances within those groups. For example, I know in Fairbanks, when I go to visit, there's a gentleman who works at he owns a Mexican restaurant there, and he and I got chatting about some of these things, and he is very strong that he is an Eskimo, not an Inuit, because the Eskimo and the Inuit group, in his opinion, those are two warring tribes. So I feel like there's a lot of nuances to that question.
Okay, great. And just a quick question, can you tell us what harbor this is in this picture?
Yeah, so this is right in Homer. This is the Homer Harbor.
Great, that's what we thought. Okay, so some people were surprised about cranberries in Alaska. So they just want to know, how big is the cranberry business, and is it also a cooperative of farmers like Ocean Spray?
It's not, and I don't even know if there's a cranberry business. I'm sure there's people who make like cranberry jam, But they would be people who just go pick for themselves wild cranberries. I have never seen a cranberry farm here. So it's all wild. If you've heard of muskeg, which is sort of the, I guess in the lower 48, you might think of it as a bog. It's sort of where tundra meets bog in a way. When you walk on it, it feels quite squishy, almost like you're walking on like a thick waterbed. And that ecosystem creates lingonberries or low bush cranberries. And that's just something that we can go out. I mean, if I drove about 2 miles from my house here, I could go to some public use land and be picking berries today.
Cool. And so there was a question about whether there's snowbirds in Alaska. You know, many people on the East Coast, they find their way to Florida, or West Coasters go to Arizona or Hawaii. Do most Alaskans just stay there over winter?
Most stay here over winter, but there are certainly a large population of snowbirds. And it's been interesting because some of them got stuck here this year. They will drive their RVs up and, you know, spend the summer here, and Canada, they couldn't drive them back, right? So that became a bit of a thing. Here we have a term called sourdough, which is a term for people who lived here for a really long time. A chichaco is someone who has never spent a winter here. So someone who maybe does just come up for the summer or just visits a little bit. It's also a place where this is defined in terms of winter. So I had never experienced that before. Like when I moved here, I would say, how long have you lived here? And people would not say 20 years. They would say 20 winters. And that's what separated them from the snowbirds, who maybe could say they've been coming here for 20 summers, but it doesn't mean they live here.
Okay, here's a question for you. What is your favorite meal in Alaska?
Oh, that's so hard. That's not fair. I would say it's salmon on the grill with potatoes and beets and carrots from the garden. Or here's the coolest thing. When we go across the bay, there's a chance, and we've done this before, where you can catch salmon right there. You can cook up a plant called goose tongue. It's not the tongue of a goose, but it's an intertidal zone plant that's like greens, and they taste like salty greens. So you can pick those, and then you could eat the salmon, and then you could pick berries. And I think that might be the perfect meal because you could literally get it all right in that spot.
That's fantastic. And there was a question about whether Alaska is able to retain young adults in the area, or do people typically move out at a certain age?
Gosh, whoever asked that question must have like kids or grandkids that moved away, because that, you know, again, you don't think that when you move to a place and you start raising your kids, you don't think at first, are they all going to move away? But it is a thing. It's definitely an issue. There's, of course, young people who stay, who, you know, my son wants to be a fisherman. My daughter, my youngest, is still young enough to say that she's never going to leave our side. She's going to live with us forever. I'm sure that's going to change really soon. But my middle daughter, if I asked her, I mean, very, very honest here, what the heart of Alaska is, and she said suckery. Because it's cold and there's no malls and there's no city. And so for her, she can't wait to get out.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on to some wildlife questions because we're getting close to the top of the hour here. Big question, when is mosquito season?
Okay, everyone who is watching this right now has to like do whatever they do to promise that they're not going to tell other people. But here in Homer, there's barely any mosquitoes. Don't tell the world. You like it, but they have this idea that it's very buggy. Now, if you go to Denali, you're going to need a bug net. And there are certainly places around Homer that you could go where there's like, you know, standing water and that kind of thing, or evening in the middle of the summer, sometimes you can find it, but we don't have screens on our doors or windows.
Right.
Because there's
Well,
not many.
that's a good tip.
I'll have to block that part out of the recording.
Yeah. You don't remember that you heard this here.
And are there wolves in the Denali area?
Yes. Oh gosh, definitely in the Denali area. There's quite a robust story actually about the wolves there. I would recommend you look up an article by Sherry Simpson, Simpson. She wrote a phenomenal article on all the stuff that happens with wolves. So there is trapping of wolves around Denali, but of course, like, they don't know that park line. And so that becomes this whole thing. Can you trap those wolves and not other wolves? It's a lot like the issues that we hear about in Yellowstone, Corbin, with the ranchers there, where there's this sort of constant struggle between the way of life, where people have trapped forever in a day, and what's right for the park and the animals and that kind of thing.
Yep.
All right, last question. When's the best time of year to visit, and what's your favorite time of year there?
I think I've already probably given away that summer is my favorite time of year. I make it through the winter because I go guide in Baja. I think that winter can be pretty tough personally. My husband would say winter is his favorite by far and away. The best time to come, Corbin, we decided you're going to come in late August, right? I think that's what we decided. It really depends on what people want to see. What I love about late August is that you can see bears, the salmon are still running, you can get some of that beautiful light that we talked about. And if you go up to Denali, you're going to see the I call it the carpet of fall colors, because the tundra rug, if you will, just is on fire with those fall colors that we're used to seeing, on deciduous trees and whatnot. So I'm going to vote for August today, but I bet if we did this talk next week, I could talk myself into picking June or another summertime.
Great. All right, well, it's just about the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there for questions and turn it back over to both of you for closing comments, and we'll start with Corbin.
Yeah, no, I just another great time with you, Annie, just chatting about somewhere that's close to home for you. So we've kind of closed the gap on where we work together and where we get to talk to each other about. So it was just a pleasure hearing from you and taking a little sneak behind the curtain into your Alaskan lifestyle.
Well, Corbin, I really appreciate you helping me share this information with everybody. The way that you ask questions and kind of bring topics to a different point is just an absolute delight. So thank you so much for that. And for all of you who are watching, thank you for joining us again. And next week, I'm going to be talking about whales of Alaska. And we didn't do too much about the water today, so we'll get a little bit more deeper onto that subject. And Kendall, thank you also for helping us with all of this. We'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, guys. It was so fun to turn the tables on you, Annie, and get to know you a little bit more. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to hear from both of you. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for coming to Alaska.